It's the ninth day of rain, and you have not been dry once. You're crouched under a rock overhang in southern France, 40,000 years ago. Water runs down the stone behind your back in thin, cold lines. Your fire is a pile of gray mush that stopped smoking yesterday morning. The ground outside has turned to mud that swallows your foot to the ankle. There is no roof, no door, no dry towel waiting anywhere on earth. Nobody is coming. There is no shop, no shelter, no way out. And here's the strange part. Your body is not built for this. Not for cold, not for wet, definitely not for both together. Yet somebody under that stone lived long enough to become your ancestor. That's the question. And the answer is far weirder than you'd expect. How did ancient humans survive weeks of endless rain? Seriously, think about it for a second before you answer. You'd think rain is the mild weather. Snow kills, rain just annoys. That's backwards. Cold rain is one of the most efficient killers alive. Water pulls heat out of your body about 25 times faster than air. That's not a metaphor. That's measured physics, and your skin obeys it. Wet clothing multiplies your conductive heat loss roughly 5 times over. So 40 degrees and raining is more dangerous than freezing and dry. Now stretch that over 3 weeks with no dry cloth in existence. The food is rotting, the fire is drowned, the bedding is soaked. Your feet, standing in wet mud for days, begin to break down, and you still have to eat every single day in that. This isn't a bad weekend. This is a survival problem with a deadline. So how did they beat it? It's not one thing. It's never one thing. There are 6 layers stacked here: where they stood, what they burned, what they slept on, what they wore, what they ate, and one final trick almost nobody talks about. Some of these are 5,000 years old. One is 77,000. And the last one flips the whole question upside down. Stay to the end for that one, because it changes everything. Let's go. Here's the thing nobody tells you about rain. Rain itself is harmless. A drop of water hitting your shoulder does nothing at all. The danger isn't the falling. The danger is what stays behind. A wet layer against your skin becomes a heat pump running outward. Dry air trapped in fur or fiber is what actually keeps mammals warm. Soak that layer and the trapped air is replaced by water. Water conducts, air insulates, rain simply swaps one for the other. That swap is the entire problem, and ancient humans understood it perfectly. Not as physics, as experience, learned by watching people die of it. So their whole rain strategy has one rule underneath everything else. Stay dry or get dry fast. Everything else is detail. Watch how that rule shows up in every single thing they built. They didn't try to stop rain. Nobody can stop rain. They managed the gap between getting wet and getting warm again. A modern hiker calls this the wet-cold window, and it's brutally short. In 45-degree rain with wind, that window is a couple of hours. Ancient humans lived inside that window for weeks at a time, which means they weren't surviving rain. They were managing evaporation. Think about that for a second. That's an engineering mindset. And it starts long before the first drop falls, because the real work of surviving a storm happens in the dry season. Gather early, dry it, stack it high, choose the ground carefully. A group that starts preparing when the rain begins is already losing. Ethnographic records of tropical foragers show the same pattern everywhere. Firewood collected weeks early, stored high, kept covered, never left outside. Food dried and smoked before the wet season, not during it. Because during it, nothing dries. That's the whole definition of a rainy season. The Hadza, the Batek, Amazonian groups all show the same rhythm. Rain doesn't get survived in the storm. It gets survived in advance. So layer 1 isn't a shelter or a fire. It's a calendar. Which brings us to where they actually put their bodies. Here's what nobody tells you about ancient shelter. Most of it wasn't built. It was chosen. And choosing was a skill you learned as a child. Look at where Paleolithic sites actually cluster across Europe and Africa. Rock shelters, overhangs, cave mouths, almost never deep inside caves. That last detail matters more than it sounds. Deep caves are wet, cold, dark, and they trap smoke against the ceiling. The sweet spot is the lip, roofed above, open in front. You get a dry floor, daylight, an escape route, and airflow for fire. Sibudu in South Africa is a textbook example of that geometry. A sandstone overhang above a river, occupied on and off for tens of thousands of years. People kept coming back to the same rock for one reason: It stayed dry when everything around it did not. But choosing wasn't just about having a roof over your head. Water runs downhill, and where it runs is where you don't sleep. Camp at the bottom of a slope and you're sleeping in a drain. Camp in a dry riverbed and a storm upstream can end you overnight. So they looked for slightly raised ground sloping away from the camp. They looked for a lip of stone that threw water clear of the floor. They noted which direction the wind was driving the rain from, and they checked whether the ceiling above them dripped or stayed dry. That's a real thing. Many overhangs seep water through the rock itself. Archaeologists can see which parts of a shelter people avoided sleeping on. The hearths and the bedding cluster in the dry zones. Every time. When there was no rock, people built, but they built low and fast. At Ohalo 2, on the Sea of Galilee, 23,000 years ago, archaeologists found 6 brush huts made from bent local branches. Not palaces, small domed frames of oak, willow, and tamarisk brush. The kind of thing a few people can throw up in an afternoon. And that speed is the point. Shelter had to be disposable. They followed food. Nobody follows food while carrying a house. So the design brief was, shed water, block wind, build in hours. Every hunter-gatherer shelter on Earth is a variation of that brief. But a roof alone would still have killed you. Here's why. Because a roof stops rain. A roof does not make you warm. For that you need fire, and fire is the fragile one. Here's the thing nobody tells you about ancient fire in the wet season. They almost never started fires from scratch. They carried them. A live ember, packed in fungus or moss inside a horn or bark tube, will smolder for hours and can be blown back into flame. That's not folklore. That's how fire moved across most of human history. Starting fire in soaking rain is difficult even with a modern lighter. So the rule was simple. Never let it go out completely. Somebody in the group was always responsible for the coal. When Otzi the Iceman was found in the Alps, frozen for 5,300 years, his pouch contained flint, iron pyrite, and processed tinder fungus, Fomes fomentarius, the horsehoof bracket fungus, beaten and treated into amadou. That material catches a spark that would die on anything else. He wasn't carrying a fire, he was carrying the ability to make one. And he carried it on his body, in a sealed pouch, always. Think about that for a second. That's a waterproofed ignition system. 5,000 years ago, and it's better than wet matches. Then there's the fuel problem, which is worse than the ignition problem. Wet wood doesn't burn. It steams, hisses, and blackens without flame. So dry wood was treated like currency and stored like currency. Stacked under overhangs, under hides, inside the shelter, off the ground. And there's a trick the wet world gives you for free. Dead standing branches, still attached to the tree, stay far drier than ground wood. Resin-rich heartwood from pine stumps burns even when the outside is soaked. Split any log, and the inside is usually dry, regardless of the rain. None of that is modern camping advice. It's ancient default knowledge. Then you have to manage the smoke. And that's a real archaeology finding. At Tor Faraj, a Middle Paleolithic rock shelter in southern Jordan, researchers modeled where the smoke from each hearth actually went. The hearths sit exactly where the airflow carries smoke away from sleepers. That's not luck. That's people placing fires with intent 60,000 years ago. Because in a shelter with a low ceiling and rain outside, a badly placed fire will blind and choke everyone inside it. Fire in the rain wasn't warmth, it was a whole discipline. And its most important job wasn't even heating your hands. It was drying things. Which brings us to the most underrated layer. Here's what nobody tells you. The floor mattered more than the roof. Lie on cold, wet ground and the earth drains heat straight out of you. Direct contact conduction, all night, over your entire back. You can have a perfect roof and still die on a wet floor. So ancient humans built beds. Actual engineered, layered beds. At Sibidu Cave in South Africa, excavators found compacted plant bedding. Layers of sedge and rush stems, centimeters thick, spread over square meters. The oldest layer dates to 77,000 years ago. That's roughly 50,000 years older than any other known bedding. And it gets better. On top of the sedge was a thin leaf layer. Botanists identified it as Cryptocarya woodii, the river wild quince. Its leaves contain natural insecticidal chemicals that repel mosquitoes. So the world's oldest known mattress came with built-in bug spray. Lynn Wadley's team published that in Science in 2011. Think about what that bedding actually does in a rainstorm. It lifts you off the cold ground and traps a layer of dry air. It's the same principle as a modern sleeping pad made of grass. And at Ohalo 2, the hut floors had grass bedding too, laid in a deliberate overlapping pattern around a central hearth. Overlapping, like roof shingles, but on the ground 23,000 years ago. That's not a pile of grass, that's a designed surface. And here's the part that shows real understanding of the problem. At Sibudu, some bedding layers were deliberately burned before new bedding was laid. Burn the old damp-infested bedding, lay fresh material on the ash. In a wet season, that is straightforward hygiene and pest control. 77,000 years ago, people were changing the sheets. So there's a dry floor and a fire. You're still not safe. Because at some point, you have to go outside, which means the layer between you and the rain has to work. And here's where the myth of the caveman falls apart completely. You picture a raw animal skin thrown over a shoulder. Wrong. A raw hide in rain becomes heavy, then slimy, then stiff as board. Untreated skin is one of the worst rain garments imaginable. What ancient humans wore was processed leather, and the process is chemistry. Brain tanning, fatty acids, and lecithin from the animal's own brain are worked into the hide, coating the collagen fibers and keeping them soft. One brain per animal, roughly. And yes, that's the actual traditional rule. But brain-tanned hide alone still stiffens when it gets wet, because those fatty acids are water-soluble. Rain washes them out. So there's a second step, and it's the one that matters here. You smoke the hide over a smoldering, punky, low-flame fire. Smoke particles chemically alter the fibers and coat the surface. After smoking, that hide can be soaked and dried repeatedly without hardening. That's not a small upgrade. That's the difference between clothing and cardboard. And that's why every traditional tanning tradition on Earth includes smoke. Then there's the outer layer, and Ötzi shows us that one directly. With his body, archaeologists recovered a cloak made of woven grass, long dried stems bundled and twined together with a drawstring at the top. Bundles of brachypodium grass tied with lime-bast fiber cord. Grass laid in overlapping bundles sheds water almost exactly like thatch. Rain runs down the outside of the stems and drips off the bottom. Researchers still debate whether it was a cape, a mat, or both. Either way, a Copper Age man in the Alps carried woven rain gear. And that is not a metaphor. That's a real object in a museum in Bolzano. Now put those layers together the way they actually wore them. Smoked leather next to the body. Grass or bark shedding water outside. A hard shell over a soft insulator. That's a modern rain jacket. Same architecture. 5,000 years earlier. Different materials. Identical logic. But clothing and shelter only keep you alive if the food holds. And here's where the rainy season gets genuinely dangerous, not just uncomfortable. Because rain does two things to food, and they pull in opposite directions. It creates a lot of it, and it destroys everything you've stored. Start with the destroying, because that's the part people forget. Warm plus wet is the exact condition mold and bacteria want. Dried meat left in humid air will spoil in days, not months. Nuts and seeds go rancid, sprout or grow fungus you cannot see. Some of those fungi produce aflatoxins, which are seriously toxic to humans. So a wet season didn't just make people cold, it attacked the pantry. The answer was smoke again, and heat, and getting food off the ground. Racks above a smoldering fire, drying and smoke preserving at the same time. Elevated caches, sealed containers, storage pits lined and capped against water. Every foraging society in a wet climate has some version of this. Now here's the counterweight, and it's the part that surprises people. Rain is also when the landscape hands you free food. Rivers rise and fish move into shallow, easily blocked side channels. Frogs, snails, freshwater mussels, and edible fungi appear in enormous numbers. Plants that were dormant push out shoots, tubers swell, greens explode. A rainy season is a low-effort harvest if you know where to look. And there's a hunting advantage most people never think about. Rain softens ground, which means tracks print deep and stay readable. Rain masks sound and flattens a hunter's scent trail on approach. Prey animals are also less alert, heads down, coats soaked, and heavy. A wet day is not a bad hunting day, it's often a good one. So the picture isn't ancient humans hiding in a cave for weeks. It's people going out in short, deliberate bursts, then drying out again. Get wet on purpose, get warm on purpose, repeat with discipline. That rhythm. Soak, return, dry, Rest is the actual survival behavior, not endurance, cycling, which is a much smarter way to spend a body. And that's 6 layers, but I've been leaving something out. Now let's be honest, because it would be easy to romanticize this. Ancient humans were not immune to rain. Rain killed a lot of them. Everything I've described is a system, and systems fail all the time. Prolonged wet exposure causes immersion foot, tissue damage from days of saturation. Skin macerates, breaks, infects. In a world without antibiotics, that's a death sentence. Damp shelters breed respiratory infection, and smoke inhalation makes lungs worse. Paleopathologists find soot-related lung markers and joint disease in ancient remains constantly. And flooding didn't negotiate. Ohalo 2 itself ended underwater. The camp is preserved precisely because the lake rose and buried it. The reason we can study those brush huts is that the water won. There's a second honest correction about the cave itself. Ancient humans did not live in caves the way cartoons show. Most groups were mobile, using a shelter for days or weeks, then leaving. The cave wasn't home. It was one node in a seasonal circuit. They survived rain partly by not being in the worst place when it came, which is less heroic than fighting weather, and far more effective. There's one last thing I saved for the end, and it's the wildest part. Everything you've heard so far treats rain as the enemy of humans. But zoom out far enough and something strange flips into view. Start with your own body, because it's the weird one here. Almost every mammal on Earth handles rain with fur that traps air. You don't have that, just bare skin and millions of sweat glands. That's our species' signature adaptation, and it is genuinely extraordinary. It let us run down prey in open heat that stops other predators. We cool by evaporating water directly off skin instead of panting. That's why humans can jog an antelope into heat stroke over a long enough chase. Now look at what that same design does in a cold downpour. The adaptation that made you the best endurance hunter on the planet is exactly what makes you the worst mammal in cold rain. No fur means no trapped air. Bare skin means direct heat loss. Rain is the one weather that turns our superpower into a liability, which is why fire and shelter aren't luxuries in human evolution. They're required equipment. We traded fur for tools, and rain collects the debt. But here's the second half of the twist, and it's bigger. Between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, the monsoon strengthened. The Sahara, today the largest hot desert on Earth, turned green. Lakes, rivers, grassland, hippos, cattle herders, rock art across the whole region. That green corridor is one of the routes people moved through Africa and out. Repeated humid periods opened and closed those corridors for hundreds of thousands of years. So rain could kill you in a single night. It also built the roads that carried our species across the world. The same water, different scale, completely opposite verdict. That's the thing about weather in human history. Nothing is only one thing. So come back to now. You're inside. It's raining on the window. You can hear it, and it costs absolutely nothing. The roof is solved, the floor is dry, the heat is automatic. Every one of those problems was solved by somebody, slowly, over thousands of years. A person who noticed that a stone lip threw water clear. A person who worked out that smoke keeps hide soft when it's wet. A person who laid grass in overlapping rows instead of a pile. None of them knew they were inventing anything. They were just cold. And they wanted to not be cold, which is the oldest motive there is. You are the descendant of everyone who got that right often enough. Next time it rains, listen for a second before you close the window. That sound used to be the most dangerous thing in the world.